Hello, listeners. This video discusses The Sense of an Ending, a novel written by Julain Barnes. Julian Patrick Barnes was born in the year 1946. He is an English writer. He won the Man Booker Prize in the year 2011 for his novel The Sense of an Ending. The novel was also shortlisted 3 times for different prizes. His honors include the Somerset Maugham Award and the Geoffrey Faber Memorial Prize, and he was awarded the 2021 Jerusalem Prize. He belongs to the literary movement postmodernism. Barnes studied modern languages at Oxford. He published his first novel in the year 1980, Moorland. His first major critical success was his novel Flaubert's Parrot, which was published in the year 1984, and his first book-selling work was Arthur and George. It is a fiction work inspired by a true crime investigated by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who's a creator of Sherlock Holmes. As I mentioned, his novel The Sense of an Ending, published in the year 2011, it won the Man Booker Prize. His most recent novel was The Only Story, released in the year 2018. Let's see the characters involved in this novel. First is Anthony, who's otherwise called as Tommy Webster. He's the protagonist of this novel. He was around 60 years old when he is telling his story. In the novel, he appears as an adolescent and young man as Tony. In the novel, he returns to his memories of 40 years back. Tony is a self-conscious person. He only discloses a certain story of his life. His qualities include wry, ironic, pleasant in company. He refers himself as peaceable, meaning quick to deflate any situation. Early during his childhood, he was awkward around women. He also had several intense relationships with women over the course of his life. He also objectifies them and takes advantage of their feeling in order to feel better about himself. To them, he also plays innocent. Adrian Finn, he is a latecomer of all boys school which was attended by Tony. Adrian joins with one of Tony's friend group. He's fascinated by literature and philosophy just like his friends, and his preferred authors are Camus and Nietzsche. His school teachers recognize him as a brilliant young student, and one of a teacher offers Adrian his job when he retires in a few years. Adrian is frequently obsessed with one question of what makes a life worth living. Later, Adrian commits suicide. Veronica Ford, otherwise called Mary Elizabeth, who's a girlfriend of Tony. She is his first girlfriend. She studies Spanish at Bristol, where she was met by Tony. She likes poetry. She comes from a well-off family and seems to have a closer relationship to her father and her brother Jack. Her mother is Sarah Ford. After the break-off, Veronica dates Adrian, which makes Tony think of her. This is Sarah Ford, who is Veronica's mother, and she is a housewife in Kent. She lives with her family. When Tony narrates a story, he remembers her as a carefree, easy-laughing woman who wants him not to let her daughter take advantage of him. Jack Ford is the brother of Veronica. He is a Cambridge student like Adrian. He is a casual and sardonic. The meaning of sardonic is skeptically humorous. Margaret is a wife of Tony, whom he meets through his job in arts administration. They have a child called Susie. So Susie is Tony and Margaret's daughter. By the time Tony begins his story, Susie is a grown-up woman and she married herself. The novel completely depicts Susie as a tolerant figure toward her father. Next is Adrian's son, who's also called as Adrian. So when Tony narrates the story, Adrian was around 40. Veronica's father, who's a civil servant. Annie. Annie is an American woman whom Tony meets while traveling around the United States after his graduation. There are other many characters in the novel which we can deal later. Let us now see the summary of the novel, The Sense of an Ending. The novel begins with a set of disjointed images which has all memories of Tony Webster. He's a narrator and the protagonist. He begins with a shiny inner wrist. The novel begins with a shiny inner wrist and ends with cold bath water behind a locked door. Tony reflects that he still does not understand time very well, even though time has changed him and molded him. When he narrates his story, he thinks that he should begin his story with his school days, since that's where it all began. He starts describing from the arrival of Adrian Finn to his all boys London high school, where he forms a close knit group of friends with Colin and Alex. Adrian becomes the next person to join in their group. He makes an impression on Tony where he makes a clever comment in history class with old Joe Hunt. Old Joe Hunt is a history teacher at Tony's school. Adrian is generally more serious than the other students in the school. He earnestly participates in school events and seriously considers their teachers' questions rather than seeking to be as clever as possible as Tony, Alex, and Colin do. Adrian in literature class with Phil Dixon. Phil Dixon is a young, recent Cambridge grad whom the students adore. He uses the new criticism method that involves sharing a poem with students without identifying information. Adrian's parents are divorced, which is rare in their environment, but Adrian keeps much about his personal life to himself. What Tony remembers about Adrian is about Adrian's stunning intellect. These group of friends disperses after they graduate. Adrian has a scholarship to Cambridge, while Tony begins studying history at Bristol. There he meets his girlfriend Veronica, Mary Elizabeth Ford, whom he describes as nice. They discuss about love of poetry. During the weekend, Tony is highly uncomfortable with Veronica's father and her brother Jack. Both Veronica and Tony continue dating during their second year. Soon as they graduate, Tony spends a few months traveling around the United States. He again dates a girl named Annie. He describes her as an easygoing, unlike Veronica. He now hears that Adrian had committed suicide. He had left a letter saying that everyone has a philosophical duty to examine life, which is a gift bestowed without anyone asking for it. And if one decides to renounce the gift, he has a duty to act upon the consequences of that choices. And now Alex and Tony, their friends from the school, they agree that Adrian's suicide is a waste, even as they admire Adrian's clear thinking logic. Soon as a year passes, they have a reunion with Colin in which they talk about Adrian, and they owe to meet again every year. But time passes by as they all are busy. Subsequently, Tony gets a job in arts administration where he meets Margaret. He marries Margaret and has a daughter, Susie. Eventually, Margaret meets a restaurant owner. Soon she betrays Tony, but that man also betrays Margaret in turn. Then the two of them again become friends. Once Margaret suggests that they can get together, but Tony believes that she does not mean it. Years pass by. Tony is now retired. He volunteers wheeling a library cart around at a hospital, and he's a member of the local history society. He concludes his narration that his life has been interesting to him. The second part of the novel begins with Tony reflecting on how growing old changes the way one thinks about time. And some things have remained the same with him. He still enjoys some of the same music, for instance. He gets along with his daughter Susie, though sometimes he thinks she seems to be patronizing him. Tony shares what has really prompted all the memories related in the book's first half. So he has received a long white envelope from a lawyer who is Eleanor Marriott, relating to the estate of Mrs. Sarah Ford. Mrs. Sarah Ford is the mother of Veronica, his ex-girlfriend. Tony now thinks about the vague memories that he had in the weekends in Clyshurst, but he cannot think any significant event. He can only think about this when Mrs. Ford has left him £500 and two documents. One is a letter from her saying that she's left him Adrain's diary. She's not sure of her own motives, but wants him to have it and thinks that Adrain's last months were happy. The diary, however, is missing. Eleanor Marriott says that Veronica Ford, who was taking care of her mother in the years up until her death, has the diary and prefers not to hand it over. Tony gets in touch with his own lawyer, T.J. Gunnell, who advises him not to characterize Veronica's action as a theft. They also ask about Veronica and Jack Ford's contact information. Margaret, his wife, asks Tony to drop the matter, but he's too stubborn to do so. As days pass by, a number of memories begin to come back to him about his time with Veronica. Memories that make him newly attracted to her. Tony remembers Veronica herself being stubborn and difficult, and so he begins a dogged email campaign, persistently writing to her every few days with the goal of finally getting his hands on the diary. Finally, Eleanor Marriott sends him a single page photocopied from the diary. The page includes a formula that Adrain has written with a number of letters on them, asking how one might calculate the relationships between the people in his life and whether it's possible to identify a chain of responsibility. Tony keeps emailing Veronica, and she finally agrees to meet him at what's known as the Wobbly Bridge in London. There, she affirms that she will not hand over the diary, but she will only hand Tony an envelope with a letter inside. When he opens it, it's Tony's own long ago letter that he sent to Veronica and Adrian. The letter is vulgar, bitter, and cruel. In the letter, he calls Veronica a cock teaser. Reading this, Tony is shocked and applauded at his younger self. Tony decides he needs to make Veronica re-evaluate her opinion about him and realize that he's not as awful as he comes across in that letter. He then writes to Veronica again, apologizing and asking for details about her life. Reading that, she seems almost happy to be asked and shares details about her parents. Her father ended up drinking too much and eventually got cancer. Her mother moved to London and seemed to be doing well until her memory started failing a few years before she died. He again emails to ask if they can meet again, not for the diary but just to catch up. And on the way to their lunch date, he has an intense memory of her dancing. Soon after the meet, Tony emails yet again to apologize her, and he wants to hear more about her life and her family. She responds, telling him to meet her at an unfamiliar tube station in North London. When they meet, she asks him to get into her car and drives up a street until they see a group of 5 men whom Tommy assumes that they are mentally ill. During their meet, Tony feels like a fool, and given that Margaret is also upset with him, they both feel lonelier. As days pass, Tony returns to North London and revisits the pub where he and Veronica had seen the group of men entering. The group of men are the 5 men whom they both met while driving the car. Tony decides to become a regular person coming to the pub. One day, the group of men enter with another care worker. At one point, Tony encounters one of the men at the bar. The man looks Tony straight in the face, and Tony quietly says he's a friend of Mary's. Mary is Mary Elizabeth, who's also called as Veronica, as I earlier mentioned. Tony realized that the man is unmistakably Adrian's son and realizes that it must be his son with Veronica. Tony feels shock and compassion, but also is forced to re-evaluate the way he's always thought of Adrian. Now he thinks he's recognized that Adrian's suicide wasn't grand and heroic, but was cowardly and weak in its own way. Soon after, Tony sends Veronica an email referring to what he has learned, but she only responds saying that she cannot understand his message. Days later, when Tony revisited the pub, he met a care worker named Terry. They both had a conversation. Terry informed Tony that Adrian is not the son of Mary and Adrian, but the son of Mary's sister. He also informed that Adrian's mother had died a few months ago. Finally, Tony gets it. Finally, Tony understands the formula that Adrian has written in his diary. It is Sarah Ford who got pregnant with Adrian's son, and not Veronica with Adrian. Once he understands the formula, Tony feels greatly unrest. The themes in this novel are memory, manipulation, self-deception. The reason why Tony receives £500 from Sarah Ford is because Sarah Ford has a son with Adrian. Adrian is the friend of Tony, and Tony and Veronica were lovers. Adrian kills himself, leaving a son. Veronica's mother, Sarah Ford, had kept Adrian's diary for a long time. The next theme is history, narrative, and truth. The novel has a lot of interpretation, narration, and also misinterpretation. The symbol used in this novel is Adrian's diary. Veronica's mother, Mrs. Sarah Ford, leaves Tony 2 documents, which is a letter and Adrian's diary, as well as £500. Typically, the novel revolves around Tony's attempt to gain access to this diary, because Tony believes that reading the diary he will understand why Mrs. Ford left to him and what he does not remember or did not understand about his long ago relationship to Veronica. The title of this novel, The Sense of an Ending, is also shared by another book by the same title. It was written by Frank Kermode. It was first published in 1967. The Sense of an Ending by Frank Kermode has a subtitle, Studies in the Theory of Fiction. This title aims to make sense of the ways that we try to make senses of our lives. The novel is divided into 2 parts, which is entitled as 1 and 2, both of which are narrated by Tony Webster when he is retired and living alone. The first part, that is 1, begins in the year 1960 which has got the description of four intellectually arrogant school friends. They are Tony, the narrator himself, Adrian, who's the most intelligent of the four, then it is Colin and Alex. The novel was adapted into a film with its same name. The film was directed by Ritesh Batra from a screenplay adaptation by Nick Payne. The film was released on 10th March 2017. Hope this video helps. If you have query, please write them. Thank you for listening.